So again, welcome to Philippians, Red Pilled. We're going to dive right into our checkpoint. So last week we taught on Philippians 4, 1 through 5, and we talked about how everything that Paul has been talking about up to this point, all of this transformation of perspective, all his encouragement to the Philippians to be that joy, to be his crown, to be that thing that can honor him at the day of Christ, applies in a whole bunch of situations, and especially we talked about last week in situations of conflict. And he specifically called out these two ladies who were having a problem. He was like, look, you guys got to pull it together. Come on now. And then he called on some other people to come alongside and help them out. And of course we talked about joy, let your reasonableness be known to all. And we ended last week with the Lord is at hand. We're going to dive in. So Philippians chapter 4 verses 6 through 9. Let's see. How do we do this? Mom, I'll read the first part. You'll read the second part. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Fabulous. And Philippians chapter 4, 6 through 9. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus.
Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you.
Thank you so much, Mom.
Yeah.
I have to confess that for both halves of the verse, I've memorized this in like the NIV 1984 version, and so every time I try to read them, I stumble because I'm like, that's not the right word. That's not the right word. So I do really love these verses. They are very memorizable, and if you haven't memorized these are really good ones to put to memory. These verses do wrap up sort of the entire section that started in chapter 4, verse 1. So Paul is continuing this exhortation that he started with to stand firm. Remember, that's that battle language. Hold your ground in a fight. Don't give up the ground that we've already won for the good news of Christ. Now, going into this, I'm going to talk, of course, about rock climbing because I have to mention all of the things that I do in my life. Now, I apologize for the leg, somebody else's leg. It's not mine. I'm all the way up here doing this rock climb. Now, let's talk about the different kinds of rock climbing. There are a whole bunch of different kinds. I'm only going to actually talk about one. What I'm doing right here on the wall, you can see over here that there are these ropes that are attached already to the top of the wall. Usually what we do whenever we go into the rock climbing gym is we just I tie into the one side, my husband ties into the other side, and then I climb up while he's on the other side, making sure that if I fall, I go about 6 inches and then I stop. And then, I get lowered down, and vice versa. However, what I'm doing over here is something called lead climbing. You may notice that very at the top there is no rope above my head. That's because, well, the rope is not at the top. The rope is just attached to me. And as I'm climbing up, I'm taking the rope and hooking it into clips that are on the wall. And we use this technique to go outside, and that's how we can rope climbs outside. It's a lot of fun. It's also terrifying because, let me just show you, whenever you fall, this is what happens. Here, let's see. There we go.
Woohoo!
Yeah. Yeah. And right here you have this really nice big space so that whenever you fall, you have like a really lovely swing outside. You don't always have that. So whenever I go lead climbing outside, it's always this mental game. Because even if the climb is easy and I am super confident in my actual skills to be able to do this climb, here's the thing. I am aware that can happen. And so I look at the wall and I say, I can make this move. I can make this move. I am sure that I can make this move. But in the moment, I am paralyzed by fear because I'm like, what if I slip? And so I have to have confidence in my ability even in those easy climbs.
And that's why you do all the lead climbing.
And that's why I do most of the lead climbing. You do some of it.
Yeah. I did share that this morning. That every once in a while I'll be like,
do you want me to lead that? I'm like, sure, Mom, go for it. Go for have fun.
And it is terrifying.
It is terrifying. And it is interesting the difference between, it can take me, honest to goodness gracious, up to a half an hour to lead a climb that I will come back to after it's set up and do it in under a minute, because it's not the skill that's the problem. It's the confidence. And that's, I think, relates well to what we're talking about today, because we're talking about anxiety. We're talking about fear. And as we slide on over here, and we're thinking about anxiety. Anxiety really is a lack of faith. It's a lack of faith in God. If we are fully confident in who God is and in what God does in our lives, then we won't be anxious. It's like me whenever I'm lead climbing. If I was fully confident in my skills, like whenever I was on the rope, then I would climb up that thing like it's no problem. But because I have the fear, because I all of a sudden am no longer confident, that's what cripples me and that's what paralyzes me. And so, again, that's what we're talking about today. We're not trusting that God is in control and holding our rope.
And I really love the way George Mueller puts it. George Mueller was that, I almost said adoption guy.
Missionary?
Yes. He was the
orphanage.
Orphanage, yes. Because they didn't have
the adoption guy
anymore. The adoption guy. They didn't do that back then. But here's what he said: to care is a virtue, and I think that's important because we're not saying just sit back and like woohoo,
right?
No to care in the world. So to care is a virtue, but to foster cares is a sin. For each anxiety is to not trust in God, but to trust in oneself and to promote inner suffering, fear, and worry. Oh my gosh, isn't that so true? Like, to care about something, that's one thing, but whenever you really like sit on it and let it fester and
you go down the whirlpool.
Yeah. And so in Philippians 2:28, Paul mentions that his anxiety would be eased when Epaphroditus was reunited with the Philippians. And here he's just describing facts, right? He knew that once Epaphroditus was back there, he would have fewer concerns.
And again, like Mom said, what Paul isn't saying, he doesn't say, don't be anxious about anything, to say, okay, well, I hope that you are never exhibit concern about anything in your life, never act on anything, don't take any action on anything. It's not, okay, Jesus, take the wheel, but it's don't let it control you. Don't let your heart fret about all of these potential outcomes. Instead, he says, okay, Philippians, instead, trust God. So we talked about joy, and joy was sort of the theme that was driving in this section. So can joy coexist with fighting with one another, with all of that anger and bitterness in our hearts? Can joy, anger, do they coexist well? No. And the same thing is true with anxiety. Joy and anxiety are opposites. They don't mix. So Paul also introduces in this section not just what the problem is, but the actual antidote, which is prayer. Now, I was talking to Mom while we were prepping for this, and I was like, the teacher in me has to take the time to delineate the differences between these words, and so we're going to do it. So prayer, supplication, and request. So you can think about prayer as the actual act of approaching God. Whenever we pray, we are approaching God. Supplication is in prayer, you're making a request, a need. So you're actually saying, hey, I need this, and that is supplication. So you can think of prayer as sort of a broader thing, supplication as a more narrow thing, and then the request is the actual thing that you need.
Right.
And I had to. I was like, I can't skip it. I realized that this is not really important, but I have to talk about it. So.
Fair. Good job. But the point here, whenever you're doing this prayer, supplication, and request, is that the Philippians shouldn't be all worried about things that are out of their control, right? Instead, they should ask the God who is in control of all things to meet their needs. And notice it says, I'm looking for it, but in everything, right? Not just ministry-related things, not just spiritual things, but all things, big, little, small, everything.
Yep. And I don't know about you guys. I think for me, sometimes it's actually easier to trust God with the really big things, like the election, the state of our nation. I'm like, God's in control. You know, like I'm like, there's only so much that I can do. He's got it. He's in control. It's whenever I'm more personally involved in situations and like my sin nature and my ability to mess things up in other people's sin natures and everybody's like all of the things mixed together. And I'm like, Lord, I know that very technically you are in control. And yet, Lord, I kind of have some concerns here about life. And so I think it is important for us to recognize that we're not supposed to be anxious about any of it. We're not supposed to let that anxiety consume us about any aspect of life. And again, for me, sometimes it's that smaller stuff that makes it even harder. Now, another part of the antidote here is thanksgiving. He specifies, don't just pray, but actually pray with thanksgiving. And whenever we are offering up thanks to God, it forces us that by offering up thanks, we're doing a few things. Mom, what's the first thing that we're doing?
Well, the first thing is we are in advance thanking God, who we know, we're recognizing that he is able and willing to act. I gave the example this morning. So if I'm going to look out in the audience, if I ask my friend Steph, would you be willing to help me with the picnic with serving the desserts? And Steph says,
no way.
After this past Sunday, I'm sure she would say that. Because I was like, I'm leaving you, sorry. But Steph says yes, and I say, thank you so much. You know why? Because I know Steph's going to do it, right? I know she's willing to do it.
That's right.
Now, if I ask the 14-year-old teenager who's already let me down 3 times, are you willing to help me with desserts at the picnic? And they say yes. I'm saying, okay, great. See you down there at 12:30.
Question mark.
And then when they actually show up, I would say, thank you so much for coming. Steph, I know she's going to follow through. We're thanking God. We know that he's going to act on our behalf.
That's right.
And I think I'm supposed to read Matthew 6:19 to 34.
We don't have to read the whole thing. We can just do a summary.
Okay. Yeah, so basically, God takes care of the birds, everything, right? And we should have confidence that he will act on our behalf. I think the ending is, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be given to you. And the very end is, I'm looking for it, Mariah.
Therefore,
do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient is the day. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Holy smokes, what version is that?
ESV.
That's not how I memorized it.
And what I really love about this particular passage is the analogies that are used, that Jesus uses, and he's like, okay, let's look at the flowers. First of all, I love flowers. I love going outside and looking at the flowers, and they are so
lovely, beautiful.
They're lovely. We'll pin that thought. We're gonna come back to that, but they're just stunning. But do the flowers have to go shopping for their petals? Do they have to work to are they concerned about where all of their beautiful appearance is coming from? No. Who provides for them?
God does.
God. Now the birds. Again, birds are cool. I especially love the raptors. They are so cool. And they swoop in and they snatch things out of there and you're like, you are amazing. But whenever the eagle is diving into the water to get its fish and then it's chomping on the fish and the scales are flopping down into the water, it's amazing. Anyway, is the eagle worried about where its next fish is coming from? No, it's just okay, we're just going for the next fish and we're going for the next fish and we're just living. Now, animals, flowers, they don't have souls like we do. However, the point is they don't even think to worry about it, and God provides for them. And let's put them on the scale. Flowers and birds, human beings, the pinnacle of creation, whom Jesus died for on the cross, sacrificing his life for ours. How much more, if God provides for the birds and the flowers, how much more will he provide and care for us? And so Jesus says, so stop it. Knock it off, y'all. Just stop it. Whether it's those little things, whether it's those superficial-ish concerns where you're like, okay, I don't need that, extra thing, or if it's something that's more substantial, one of those deep needs of life, God is our Heavenly Father. He loves us and he's looking out for us. So that's the first thing that Thanksgiving does. But Thanksgiving also makes us acknowledge God as the one who is responsible for our deliverance. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've multiple times in my life prayed for something, and then like I prayed for it once, and then I sort of walked away from the prayer request, and then God answered it, and I realized later, I was like, oh my goodness, God answered that request in kind of a big way. But I didn't find out about it later, but I was like, oh, the Lord did that. But had I not prayed about it, I would not be aware that God was working. Like, I would just sort of take that thing for granted. And so prayer opens our eyes to what God is doing behind the scenes. Now, don't ask me the questions about, well, Mariah, so if we didn't pray, would God? I'm like, I don't know. I know that God is in control, and I know that we have choice, and how those things work together is one of the great life mysteries. So, I don't know. Pray as if God was doing everything, act as if he wanted us to do the things that he wants us to do. So thanking God reminds us of the truth that God is the one who's weaving the threads together behind the scenes.
Yeah. And the third thing it does is it really builds our relationship with the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Mariah in the book had the example of just us at home, and I thought of me and Earl. And we have really gotten into the habit of thanking one another to the point where if you sat at our table, you might think this is ridiculous, stop it. Where he would say, thanks so much for dinner. I'm like, well, thank you for stirring the beans while I was whatever. And he said, well, that's no problem. Thanks for making everything else great. I say, well, thank you for working hard so that we can. It's really like those two little chipmunks who go back and forth. But it really builds our relationship because we don't take each other for granted, right? Mm-hmm. We're really building our relationship. And I think of, I'm sorry, I'm going to throw some of your former boyfriends under the bus.
Do it.
A former boyfriend.
They're all former, so you know.
Former. Who would come over and would never say thank you, and I was like,
that's a red flag. We're just throwing that out there.
And I'm pretty sure I said something to him. You know, he never says thank you for dinner, and I
it was
feed
an
him dinner
object
a
of
lot.
contention in the relationship.
But it definitely builds a relationship and makes it stronger.
That's right.
Saying those thank yous have a big impact.
Mm-hmm. It's really that grease for the wheels of the relationship. And whenever it's not there, you feel it. You're like, you start to feel that, well, am I really appreciated? And again, it's not that God is just like us in those ways, but in the same way that when we do those things with each other, we're building that relationship. Whenever we thank God, we're building that relationship with him. And so, as we slide forward, as we pray, as we offer thanksgiving, and we lay all these things at God's feet, we end up with God's peace as sort of acting as a guard for our hearts.
Yeah, and the Greek word here is, honest to goodness, do you have it up on the board? It's E-I-R-N-N-N. What do you even do with that?
There are multiple apostrophes, and she was like, oh, I want to take the Greek word. I was like, go for it. I was like, I'm going to delete it from the notes. And she was like, I want it. I was like, okay, you go for it.
Conveys a range of meanings, right? Including well-being, prosperity, freedom from anxiety, safety from harm, and deliverance from enemies.
Right.
As Jesus says in John 14:27, the peace he offers is totally different from the peace the world gives.
That's right. And there you go. Go ahead.
Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you.
That's right.
Don't you hurt be troubled, neither let them be afraid.
Oh
Sorry.
My gosh. Do the whole finish fast.
I'm done. I just realized there was more to the verse.
You were like,
oh, wait, there's more.
Hold on. That was only A. Okay. Whenever we don't lean on God for that peace, when we lean on the things of the world, or even things that they're not bad, but they aren't meant to be relied upon. So the people in our lives, our churches, our jobs, anything, our kids, anything else that we're relying upon to provide that buffer for our hearts is going to fail. And it's not going to be all-encompassing. Only God's peace is able to completely shield our hearts and our minds in Christ. And I was thinking, there's so many times in our lives where I've walked into the middle of a situation where somebody is going through just chaos. Their life is crumbling, and yet they turn and they look me in the eyes and they say, you know what though? It's okay. And it is, you're like, how are you not crumbling on the floor, desperate? And it's that supernatural peace.
Yeah, and I think I thought of two examples. One of the Rice Snyders,
Yeah.
During multiple things, and then recently,
Gordon Renninger.
yeah, I was like, I don't remember his name anymore.
I know. I was
I had
blanking
it
on a
this
whole
morning.
bunch of names this afternoon.
Gordon Renninger, we went to visit him in the hospital, and he was a younger, 60s man, right? And he passed away from cancer. But when we went to visit him, he knew it was his last days, and wow, that family just had peace.
Rock solid peace.
Yes, and it was beautiful.
And I think it's, again, important for us to remind ourselves that in the middle of all these things, the peace doesn't come from a knowledge that everything is going to work out the way we think that it should. Because often it doesn't. And I think oftentimes it's by design. The Lord says, you know what? That is what you want. But in my grand scheme, my grand plan of redemption for the whole world, I'm pulling this thread a different direction. And I want you to trust me that I am the God who loves you, and I've got my eye on this whole thing, and I am going to pull it through okay. But you've got to hold on. You got to trust the plan. You have to trust the process. Thank you. I'm like, there's something, and it's totally not there. But we do. We have to trust that God is allowing and sometimes even placing these trials in our lives, these really hard, difficult circumstances, and He's using them to shape us, to help us to shine for the world, to strengthen the church. And we don't always see those things on this side of eternity, but the peace comes from knowing that God is on the other side working those things out. One other little teacher note that I have to point out. So hearts and minds working together here, they are functioning as sort of two ends of the spectrum. Hearts, we've talked about this before, isn't like the heart of the emotions, but it's the heart of the center of a person, the inner self, and then the minds is sort of what we think of when we think of minds. And so Paul is just using to say, hey, everything about us, God's peace covers it all. It's going to protect everything. As we move forward in the verses here, we have another one of these lovely transition phrases. Who would like to point it out? Finally, it's the finally. Now, last time we looked at the word finally, did it mean that it was the last time? No, it was deceptive. How dare they use the word finally whenever it makes us think finally. For this time, it's for reals. It's sort of introducing his last list of, it's not going to be the last thing he says in the letter, but it's his last sort of full list of commands to the Philippians. And so this is what he's doing. Thinking about these things, he's really focusing on the mind. Mom.
Yeah, so our thoughts are critical because if we have right words, actions, but our thoughts are bad, is that good? No, because inevitably what's going to happen? What's in your mind is going to follow through with your thoughts and your actions, right? Or your thoughts and your actions and your words.
Thoughts first, then other stuff.
Thoughts, then other stuff comes out, right? So Romans 12:2 is critically important. So that is, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do you have a song?
Yeah, from BBS.
Be transformed. Be.
Right. So the battle that we fight actually starts up here, right, between our ears, right? And Paul is exhorting the Philippians to take control of their thought life first, because that's where the battle starts. So by doing that and leaning on God,
I'm calling out the troublemakers with my eyeballs. That's
so they need to rely on God and be very intentional about their thoughts. Go.
And because it is a battlefield, I think, and I was reflecting on this today as I was going back through just everything in the book. We really do, it's real choices whenever we think about our thought life, but I think it's oftentimes the hardest battlefield because our thoughts are invisible. And it's so easy for us to just think, and to just be caught up in all of these thoughts, and we oftentimes don't realize what we're thinking. We don't realize the path that we've led ourselves down until we're already so far down that it becomes really hard to drag ourselves out. And so I was even, again, as I was going through this, I'm like, okay, what things can we do to help break the cycle? And we have to be be intentional about examining our thoughts, about bringing them before the Lord, about maybe even vocalizing the things that are going on inside, so that as we bring them out of the darkness of our minds into the light and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking, and actively place them before the Lord and say, okay, ooh, that was a little bit darker than I realized that it was. Wow, that really is not expressing faith in God. Wow, that was really critical of this person. I don't think that is honoring to this relationship that I have with this person. And so again, it's like lead climbing. It's that choice where, and we just, bless you. This actually just happened in Colorado. Whenever we were climbing out there, there was one climb that I knew it was easy. It was an easy rated climb, and here's the thing that happened. You ready? The rain was coming in, and so I was like, I have to decide either to get to the top of the wall or to abandon gear. And so I was like, I am choosing to believe in myself. I'm just gonna go. And so then I basically panicked, climbed up the wall, and Mom did a really, I think it was you, Mom, we're gonna say it was Mom, did a really nice job of sticking with me and not pulling me down the wall with the rope, because I did definitely speed up. I was like, okay, I'm just going to choose to put the fear out of my mind, and I'm just gonna climb. And I'm going to do it. And I didn't die. So the choice is simple, but not necessarily easy. Knowing the right thing to do or the right thing to think is like, it's clear, but it's not always an easy process. But as we start to do it, as we start to break those cycles, it will lead to good things. Again, and the rest we're gonna talk about that in a little bit. So we have a whole bunch of things that Paul does list out for us to think, and I think this is part of the thing that makes breaking the cycle easier, because if you just say, stop doing this, stop doing that, stop doing that, well, like if I say, don't think about the blue elephant, don't think about a blue elephant, don't think about the blue elephant.
Stop it, Ryan.
What are you guys all picturing? You're all picturing the blue elephant, because it's very hard to do. What if I say instead, think about a pink cheetah? Now you guys are all like, a pink cheetah, hold on, I have to actually think about that one. And it's a lot easier to replace with the good rather than to just subtract the bad. So he has a list of all of these things. Mom, start with the first one.
I will start with the first one. So the first one is whatever is true. So truth is what lines up with reality, right? Have anybody ever heard all truth is God's truth? Mm-hmm. Right, all truth is God's truth. So this whole list is actually pulled from Greek virtues. Mm-hmm. So truth, all truth is God's truth. Remember, God is the creator of the world, so all of the laws of science, the things about motion, all of those things, psychology, all of the truth is all from God. Mm-hmm. And so whenever we think about what is true, whatever is honest, reliable, the things that are true in God's standards.
Right. And sometimes, whenever we go through this list, sometimes it may be easier to think about the opposites, mm-hmm. to help us paint a picture of the actual thing. Our world right now, especially our Western culture, is struggling immensely with the idea of truth as something that we can actually, as a real concept. They're like, truth? What is truth? And you're like, are we in the Matrix? And they're like, yes, you are. And even things like simple biology, where they're like, well, what is a woman? And you're like, XY chromosomes. And they're like, nope, that's wrong. And so whenever you come across the situation, it's very tempting to allow ourselves to start thinking like the world and just say, okay, well, feelings are what matter. But no, we have to think, we have to be firm, even starting in our thought process of what is true. And so Next we have, I went to click to the next thing, like it's not there. Whatever is honorable. NIV is noble, something worthy of respect or that has dignity of moral excellence.
Yeah, and Paul uses this term in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 and 11 to describe the ideals for deacons and their wives. Our leaders especially ought to embody these qualities, and that doesn't mean we're exempt. We're just holding these leaders up to these standards. They're highlighted. But what does it mean to think about them?
Right. And as I was preparing the lesson, I was thinking about all of the things that I happen to listen to, because I don't really read a whole bunch of things or watch a whole bunch of things, but I listen to a lot of audiobooks and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and there's a lot of stuff out there that is not super honorable, that's not super worthy of respect, does not have moral excellence. And if you think, okay, if somebody else walked into the room while I was watching, reading, listening to this, would I want to pause? Because I would be like, ooh, I don't really want, I mean, it's not that bad, but still. Then probably not something that we should be allowing into our minds. So next is right.
Yeah, right. And the ESV translation is actually just. And things that are just align with justice, right? They conform to God's standards. There are a lot of competing systems of rightness and justice today. You guys know that. And if we fill our minds with them, we'll end up living them out.
Yep. Again, our American culture, our justice system is, I've increasingly become for a while, I was like, oh yeah, the American system of justice, like, it's all that in a bag of chips. And recently, especially in the last, I think, 10 to 15 years, like, it has especially just gone completely down the tubes. And again, so even if we like, okay, no, we know what's right. We know what the just reaction is. But if we get into the social media dunghill of all of the negative thoughts and all of the negative words, and if we allow all of that injustice to sort of build up inside us, it's going to do bad things to us. The next one, number 4, is pure. Now we've actually talked about this word in Greek before, all the way back in the beginning, chapter 1. We talked about the word hagnos, which there was translated as, anybody remember? Anybody want to take a guess?
Yes!
Saints. Yep. So saints is the same word for pure. Remember back then we described the word saint as somebody who has actually crossed from death into life. They have the moral standing before Christ that we emphasize that it's not about in that context. It's not like, okay, well, you have to live this way in order for you to be a saint. It's a characterization of something of a position that you already have. However, it can also be a character trait, which is what's being described here. And so those who have been set apart by Christ should be living up to that standard, and that should start with our minds. And again, think about all of the different things that we can dive into with our thought life. We don't want to be diving into all of the same muck and filth that the rest of the world does. Next is lovely.
Next is lovely. And lovely is an odd word whenever you think about it, because right away you think of the lovely bride. But
that's
there's,
what I thought of.
No.
I was like, friends.
But it's not something that you necessarily use every day, unless of course you're in Ireland, because Patsy told me this morning. In Ireland they use that
it's
for
lovely.
everything. Well,
I don't live in Ireland.
I don't live in Ireland, and I don't speak it either. But if you've ever come across a person who is so pleasant and sweet and easygoing and just made your heart sing. Now this morning, I actually had 2 kid examples, and both of their parents are here.
Okay.
And they may or may not end up getting married because they're both just too happy. Adeline and Jack, who both, every time they see me, their face lights up and they run and give me this hug. They're like, just because you see them, it just makes your heart happy, right? And that's those lovely things, like a flower that makes your heart sing, or a mountain, or a beautiful lake. All of those lovely things that just make your heart, that's lovely.
Yeah. And I was actually especially challenged by this word because I was thinking, I'm like, am I that kind of person who, whenever people interact with me, that's their reaction to me? That it's like, that was just such a lovely interaction. And I was like, I mean, they may say like funny or I like to think that, maybe I have an insight or something, but I don't know if lovely would be the word out of their mouths. And I was challenged. Okay, I think I really want to reflect on whatever is lovely. Am I exemplifying that character trait? And it starts with the mind.
And start by running up and giving your mom a hug every time you see her, because
I'll do my
with
best.
that beaming face too.
Exactly. Now the next word here is commendable, and in the book I gave the example of whenever at the rock gym, one of my jobs part of the job that I really enjoy. I don't actually know if this is part of the job description or if I just took it upon myself, but it's writing letters of recommendation for my staff whenever they have like the National Honor Society applications or they're applying for a different position, and I'm like, I'm sorry, you're leaving me? Why are you leaving me? Anyway, but so whenever I write these letters of recommendation, I'm always really, really glad to do so, because my coaches, even though every once in a while, like, they may be late or they may call out for a shift, as we talked about last week, for the most part, they're really awesome. They do their jobs well. They come in and their hearts are just focused on loving those little kids well and helping them to learn to rock climb, and they want to do a good job. And so I'm like, oh, I want to commend them. And so as I'm thinking about this letter of recommendation, I'm rehearsing in my mind all of their traits that are commendable. And as I think about them, I'm actually more inclined to, well, have that translated into my actions, my attitudes, and my words toward them. Because again, it starts with the mind. And so again, as I think about myself, I think, okay, am I living in such a way that is commendable? And again, it starts with the mind.
And I think this morning we also talked about not only thinking that, but thinking commendable things about other people who you just interact with.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave the example of my dear husband, who I love dearly. And I said, if any of you have people in your life who are perfect, they're probably Jesus, right? Because everybody we know has faults in addition to the positives.
Right.
So I try to think about the positive of my husband, not the fact that he leaves his coat over the sofa every single day, even though we have a coat rack literally right there. But if
we all have those every day. I don't understand why they can't.
Exactly.
It's fine.
But if I dwelt on that, that would be terrible. That would bring me down. But no, I'm thinking about the positive things, like, well, my husband's alive, for one thing. And also,
I feel like we can aim higher. Aim higher now.
Some days that's about all.
But for ourselves too, right? For ourselves as well, because I'm quite sure that he would never do this. Like, he would never go around and say, well, Mariah always, and fill in the blank, because he's a really sweet guy. But he could say, well, Mariah doesn't, fill in the blank. Mariah sometimes when she comes home from work, and he could lay out stuff and he could pick and nag at things that I do, and he doesn't. Again, because he's this person. But so we want to practice that commending spirit toward other people.
Absolutely.
And hoping that they'll do the same for us, because we're all sinners.
Yes.
Hello, we're having Bible study. So the last two terms on the list, sort of summed up with the if anything is, so excellent or worthy of praise. I don't know if this is the reason why, but for these two phrases, these are the only two nouns on the list, and all of the rest of them are adjectives. So I was like, well, maybe that's why the phrasing changes there from whatever is to if anything is. I don't actually know, but that was my hypothesis there. And what Paul is really saying here is, hey, these are the two sort of broad terms to describe this entire list. So whatever you can think of that falls into this range of things, whatever the best of the best of the best of the best things are, think about these things. Whatever categories in life that you can put into your brain, dwell on these things. Center your minds on these things.
Right, and so Paul's going to conclude now by once more referring them to the example of his own life, right? So even though we look at this list that Mariah just moved off of, and we could be like, oh my gosh, that's sort of overwhelming.
I mean,
yeah,
it is a
Paul
little bit
says,
overwhelming.
well, look at me, I've walked this walk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not that Paul said that he did it perfectly, but he encourages us to do that. And the example that I thought of was, I've mentioned her before, June Carroll. And June Carroll, dear woman, suffered with terrible, terrible rheumatoid arthritis, right? But she was always so positive, thinking positive things, saying positive things, being encouraging. And so even though I suffer with migraines much less than I used to, anytime I have that or any other kind of pain thing, I always think of June. And I think, even though that woman had pain every single moment of the day, how joyful she was and how she really just dwelt on the positive. I never heard her complain once or say anything negative, except maybe the nurse doesn't know the Lord.
And as we think about Paul pointing to himself as that example of, hey, thinking these things and then living them out, he also reminds the Philippians that what starts in our minds should be translated into our actions. And again, like we said toward the beginning, our thoughts eventually will be translated into actions. If our minds are dwelling on this whole list of things, if we are centering on our hearts, on things that are good, things that are lovely, then we will end up living them out, which is again back to that Romans 12:2. We have to let our hearts be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and that's something that only God does. And so the question is, do you want to be a Christian like Paul? And I'm like, yeah, yes. I feel like I can't, but it's possible. Do we want to experience that peace? Then we have to govern our thoughts. We have to. 2 Corinthians 10:5, Paul says that we have to take every thought captive to obey Christ. And so we have to be like me whenever I'm lead climbing and have a little bit of faith, but not in our ability to climb, but in the fact that it is God who is holding our rope. And he will not let us fall. No matter what circumstances we face, no matter what circumstances those that we love face, God is in control. God is weaving that tapestry of redemption, and one day he's going to flip it around and we're going to be like, I see. But for the meantime, we know that the God of peace is with us. And so, hike your own hike is our code word for homework. It's not really homework because I don't check it. I have enough grading to do. I already have assignments coming in. I'm like, I just assigned this today. How are you doing this? So your hike your own hike work, Philippians 4:6-9 recap checkpoint is on page 189. For next week, the section that we're doing is Philippians 4:10-20. This is our final chunk before our review week. So pages 191 through 207. Run like you stole it. Thanks. Bye.